Thank you so much for all organizers to put me into the program. And thanks everyone who remained. It's very last presentation and very long day. And finally, I assume that I have 5 more minutes compared to the schedule, right? Perfect. So as previous speakers, I suggest to ask questions on the way we go. I think this is going to be easier. And the paper I'm going to present today, I think very nicely fit with some of the research that's already been presented, like Igor's research on building credit history and Julia's research on SME and FinTech. So here's I'm going to do it in slightly different context. I'm going to talk about the context where credit history pretty much doesn't exist. And also FinTech is not at the level where small and medium-sized enterprises are not required collateral. So I'm going to talk about financial frictions and land property rights in the context of low-income countries. So as already was mentioned, those countries or level of financial development in those countries is extremely low. But on top of this, they also have insecurity in land property rights. So where exactly this insecurity is coming from? The first reason, it is lack of land formalization. So when you look at the map on this slide, you see the share of land in different countries in the world that doesn't have any documentation. And if we zoom in into the African continent, we observe that most of the countries are colored in red and orange, meaning that a large share of land in those countries doesn't have any title or any other formal document, or even informal documentation. Secondly, the kind of insecurity in land property rights is coming from presence of so-called communal land. So what is communal land? Communal land, such lands that doesn't have any formal property rights, but it is governed by norms and customs within the communities. And one of the major principles among those norms is use it or lose it principle, meaning that whoever uses the land in the current period of time can continue using this in the future. However, if in a given period of time, the farmer or the household decides not to operate the land, this land can be taken away from them and reallocated to somebody else in the community. So, as a result of both lack of land formalization and presence of such communal land, we observe that in low-income countries, land first could not be sold or rented out. Second, it's subject to expropriation risk. And finally, this land cannot be used as collateral. So why am I emphasizing this last thing, that land cannot be used as collateral? Because when we think about households in those countries, they almost do not have any financial wealth. But majority of them, because of this communal land, they do have some land holdings. Therefore, giving them titles or improving formalization of the land might also bring them to the financial sector or improve their financial inclusion. More formally, what I'm doing in this paper, I'm looking at the effect of land and financial market frictions on the aggregate productivity and allocation of resources in low-income country context. And importantly, I'm also looking at the interaction between those two markets. And the way I'm doing this, I incorporate both land and financial market frictions into heterogeneous agent macro model, and then use this model to study what would be the effect of land reform. So how this would affect economy and resource allocation, and also I'm looking at different channels of this reform, including these collateral channels that represents interaction between land and financial markets. And I'm doing this in the setting of low-income country, as I mentioned, and specifically I'm using very detailed micro-level data from Tanzania to do some empirical exercises and also estimate parameters of the model. Given that I'm only having 40 minutes, let me give preview of the results in case I'm not going to reach the last slide. So what I'm doing in this paper, on the empirical side, I'm not only using data to calibrate my model, but I also use this data to show that there is misallocation of resources in agriculture in Tanzania. And importantly, I'm able to link this misallocation to two sources. First, insecurity in land property rights, and second, limited access to credit. Then I use my model to study the effect of land reform. And here, importantly, when I say land reform, I'm meaning such reform that allows households to obtain the title for their land. So there's going to be no redistribution involved. Just we're moving from the economy with weak property right regime to the economy with strong property right regime. So what I find is a result of this reform, that first it leads to quite substantial increase of agricultural output by more than 7%. And this increase is primarily driven by better allocation of land across farmers. So in other words, as a result of this reform, land moves from farmers that are not very efficient in agriculture to those who are efficient in this sector. Secondly, and probably more surprising, I find that land reform also leads to increase by even higher magnitude in non-agricultural output. And such increase is primarily driven by better allocation of households across occupations. So as a result of this reform, households are moving from sectors where they're not productive to the one where they're more productive. And as a result of this shift, the share of farmers in the economy decreases by more than 8%. Finally, when I looked at the impact of collateral channels that represents the interaction between two markets, I find that it's qualitatively, in terms of its effect on different sectors, is very similar to the impact of financial reform. But it has very different distributional consequences. But this I'm going to talk a little bit later. And just to summarize the main findings, I find that land market frictions amplify financial market imperfections, and this effect is particularly strong for the poorest part of population who doesn't have much of financial wealth but does have some land. So the plan for today's talk, I'm going to start with a model framework. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the data that I'm using and what kind of exercises I'm doing to show that there is misallocation actually in the data. And in part 3, which I think probably the most important part, I'm going to describe the model mechanism by looking at the decision of each individual household using the objective function. And finally, after this, I'm going to show you the results of aggregate results of land reform. So let me start with the model. So it is heterogeneous agent model, and agents are heterogeneous in 5 parameters. The first 2 are related to their level of productivity, first in agricultural sector, second in entrepreneurship. Both of those productivities, they are not constant across time, they're subject to idiosyncratic shocks, but households kind of aware what the probability of each of the shock. Second, households own some land, which is non-negative, and this land could be either private land or communal land. And when I say communal or private, I mean communal land is land with weak land property rights. Private land is land with strong property rights. And finally, households can accumulate endogenously their wealth or financial assets. It's infinite horizon and time is discrete. And what model has? First, model incorporates endogenous occupational choice. And there are 3 occupations available for each household. They could become farmers, entrepreneurs, or they could become workers that are being hired by entrepreneurs. Second, the model has endogenous evolution of communal land, and I'm going to stop on this a little bit later more, to capture this use it or lose it principle. Finally, it's forward-looking saving decision or accumulation of financial wealth, and both land and financial markets are incomplete. So now, before I will show you the actually household problem or optimization function, let me talk about imperfections on 2 markets. Starting with the land market, there is total amount of land which is fixed available in the economy, and share of this land mu L is communal, or as I mentioned before, it's land under weak property rights, and 1 minus mu L is private. And each household endows some amount of land which is non-negative, and what is key here, what are the differences between communal land and private land? So communal land, first, it could not be rented out. So households, even if they have it, they're not allowed to rent it out. Second, it's subject to expropriation risk, but only in the case it's not being used in their production. Again, to capture this use it or lose it principle. So the way it's going to work, imagine you a household and you have some amount of communal land. Then in a given period of time, you decide, shall I use all the land? Shall I become farmer or move to other occupation? And if you decide not to use part of your land, this land will be subject to expropriation risk. So in other words, with some positive probability, this land, the village head gonna take from you, and then this village head gonna relocate this land to other who are eligible, with some positive probability pi r. And the way in the baseline model, I assume that pi r is positive only for those households that are already staying in agriculture. And finally, communal land cannot be used as collateral. And on the other side, private land is not subject to any land market imperfections. However, everybody in the economy is subject to financial market frictions. So the way financial sector works in this model, it's very simple. In terms of the financial intermediary, it's competitive, it takes deposits and make loans. And I assume the following financial market frictions. First, there are no state contingent bonds available in the economy, which means that households are not able to insure themselves against those productivity shocks that they experience. Second, I assume that financial wealth is not negative, meaning that households are not able to borrow to smooth out their consumption. However, they're able to borrow within period to finance their capital usage. But the amount of financing that's available for those households is subject to a limit or to the collateral constraint. And what households are able to use as collateral? Two things. First, they're able to use their financial wealth, and this choice of how much financial wealth to have or accumulate throughout the time is endogenous. And second, they could use their land, but only if this land is private land, if it's under strong property right regime. Therefore, if we combine and do a little or very simple mathematical derivation, we find that the amount of capital that households able to use is limited by some fraction of their financial wealth, as well some fraction of their land, given the price of the land. Okay. Now, just to give you a little bit more details on how households making their decision, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to show you household problem conditional on occupational choice. So in the model, each household maximize their value function among 3 occupations, but within each occupation, there are differences that I'm going to highlight between private landholders and communal landholders. And most of the things that highlighted here in orange is actually represent those differences in terms of the household choices. So first, remember, I told that private land is not subject to any land market imperfections. Meaning that households that have private land, their land not subject to any expropriation risk. Therefore, you see that in the state variable of the private landholders, Li is not doesn't have any t subscript, meaning that the amount of land that they have is fixed across time, or the amount of land that they own is fixed across time. Second, they spend their money on consumption and accumulation of assets, and the income coming from 3 sources. First, it's income from the occupation. Second, it's interest income from their financial wealth. And finally, it's rental income from the land that they are not using in their production. Again, it's highlighted in orange because only those who have private land are allowed to rent out actually unused land. Finally, both entrepreneurs and farmers using capital in their production, and this capital is limited by their amount of financial wealth and the amount of land. Now going to the income from each occupation, the income of entrepreneur is very simple, is a profit of the firm that this entrepreneur runs, and the output of this firm is determined by the household's entrepreneurial productivity, amount of capital, and amount of labor that this entrepreneur uses. The income of worker is very simple. It's the wage that entrepreneurs pay to their workers, and the income of the farmer is the profit of the farms that this farmer operates, and the output is determined by the level of agricultural productivity, amount of capital, and amount of land is being used. Here are 2 important things. First, as you can see, both for entrepreneurs and for farmers, the production functions exhibit decreasing return to scale. So this assumption would be very important when we come to the quantitative exercise in terms of what would be the efficient allocation of resources. And I'm going to get back to it when I show you some empirical results. Secondly, if you look at the production function of the farmer, you observe that the farmer is using only capital and land, and they do not hire any labor. So this assumption is very convenient for the model purposes, but also it reflects what we at this stage observe in the data in Tanzania. So when we look at the farmers that operate in Tanzania, most of them are small farmers, but on top of this, they mostly most of the labors that they use is coming from within the household. So 90% of the labor employed in agriculture is actually household labor. So I think like for now, for given current state, this assumption is okay. Question is, when we do land reform, whether this is gonna change? I think yes. This is not how it's modeled yet. Okay, now let's move to those who live under communal land. Now thinking first about farmers. So when we think about farmers and their difference compared to the private landholders, those farmers are not allowed to rent out their land, right? But their production function is increasing in land. Therefore, in optimum, those farmers would never use less land than they actually have. They might use more land, but never less. Meaning that if they decide to become farmers, their land never going to be subject to expropriation risk. Therefore, in terms of their production, in terms of their value function, with some positive probability pi r, in the next period, they might receive this endogenous amount of entities that being expropriated from everybody else in the community. And with probability 1 minus pi r, they're going to remain with the same amount of land as before. And here again, here now you don't see this orange that been here before, simply because you're not allowed to rent out their land, and the amount of capital they're using is subject only to the amount of financial wealth, since they couldn't use their land as collateral. Now, when we're thinking about workers and entrepreneurs who own communal land, they're not using any land in the production, meaning that all lands that they have will be subject to expropriation risk. Therefore, in the next period, with positive probability pi e, all the lands that they have right now are going to be taken away from them, and with probability 1 minus pi e, they're going to remain with the same amount of land. And again, the rest of the problem differentiates it from the private landholders similarly. They're not allowed to rent out land, entrepreneurs not allowed to use land as collateral. And now I want to spend like 5 minutes on the data and how I use this data to show that there is misallocation in agriculture in Tanzania, and that this misallocation is linked to these land and financial market imperfections. And the reason why I chose in Tanzania, because first, it's country that's very dear to my heart. It's the country where I first traveled solo, but this wasn't the reason primary. It's because it has great data and some variation in land property rights, both across household and across time. So first, around 70% of land there is communal land, while the rest is private. And secondly, the government there actually realized the issue of insecurity in land property rights. And what I think actually when I read what happened, I think actually De Soto came to visit the government and suggested you need to privatize all the land so households will be able to use this as collateral. However, the problem is that those reforms are not cheap, and therefore they're primarily financed by foreign governments and NGOs. And the way it worked in Tanzania, particular NGO or foreign government, they decided, oh, those are going to be the districts where we're going to give titles to the households. And then they came, they measured the land, installed the computer and everything, but none of those foreign governments or NGOs were able to finance the entire reform. Therefore, we see some progress, but it's very far away yet from 100%. But for me as a researcher, too bad for Tanzanian people, for me as a researcher, it still gives me a variation both across time and across space that I'm going to leverage in my empirical exercise. So what exactly I'm doing? So I'm starting by estimating agricultural production function. An estimation of agricultural or any other production function, of course, is subject to endogeneity concerns. And in my paper, I'm addressing them by using dynamic panel approach, which I think way more appropriate both for agricultural setting and for low-income country compared to more structural approaches. And what I find is that in Tanzania, agriculture is primarily labor and land intensive, and most of the households do not use any capital. And when I say do not use any capital, I'm not saying they don't use tractors. Most of them do not even use any type of tools to help in agriculture. But importantly, remember when I showed you the models that one of the key assumptions I'm making that production function exhibits decreasing return to scale. And this is indeed what I find. I find that the production function or agricultural production function in Tanzania exhibits decreasing return to scale. Why it's important for my empirical exercise? Because if production function has decreasing return to scale, then when there are no market frictions, what we're supposed to observe in the data is that the amount of land that each farmer uses supposed to be proportional to his or her productivity. And this is exactly what I'm testing in the data. Do we observe this relationship there? And the answer is yes. We do observe this relationship, and indeed the amount of land that farmers using is proportional to their level of productivity. However, again, if there were no frictions, this relationship should not vary across farmers. So it's supposed to be homogeneous irrespectively of some other characteristics. And this is exactly what I'm testing, whether it's homogeneous or not. And what I find that it's actually very heterogeneous, and this heterogeneity is specific coming from insecurity in land property rights and access to credit. So I find that the relationship higher for households who has or own land under strong property rights and those who have been using some credit for agricultural purposes. This kind of suggests that land misallocation linked to land and financial market imperfections. Of course, this exercise relies on a number of assumptions, and in my robustness findings, I'm trying to address them by estimating, by relaxing the assumption production function, by trying to address selection issues. Importantly, what I'm also doing, I'm kind of exploiting this fact that like most of the land reform or most of the land titling throughout these years happened because NGOs and foreign governments finance, and it's kind of, at least within those villages, supposed to be exogenous. While again, it's like I don't want to do very strong claims. I also like only looking not cross-sectional and time variation, but also only time variation, I find the same result. So total, I'm doing like 20 more exercises, and the findings are consistent. Finally, what I want to point out, and this is important in terms of like my modeling choices, and I will come back to those things a little bit later when I show you the model mechanism. Again, I'm here exploiting only variation across time, so I'm controlling for households fixed effect. And what I find that households who obtain title for their land, they're more likely to get the loan, and conditional on getting one, the size of the loan is larger. Second, they're more likely to rent out their land. And finally, in terms of the occupational choices, they're more likely to operate non-agricultural enterprise, and they're less likely to be in agriculture by different measures. And I will get back to those assumptions. But again, here, importantly, this is not an RCT. So I couldn't claim like perfect causality, but I think given what I'm doing and throughout all those exercises, consistent results, I think at least it's convincing that there is something going on. So now, let me come to the quantitative analysis, which in my opinion, the most exciting part of the model or of the paper generally. And I'm going to start by describing the model mechanism before I'm going to turn to the results of the land reform. And the reason why I want to proceed this way, because model is quite complicated and has many things going on at the same time. So showing you how decisions of the household depend on whether they are subject to different types of frictions, I think will give you kind of very intuitive understanding of the aggregate results. And just to remind you, what are main channels through which land market imperfections affect economic outcomes? First, it's expropriation risk. This would primarily affect efficiency of labor allocation. So in other words, as you will see in 1 or 2 slides, people would be scared to lose their land, therefore this would prevent them from moving from agriculture to other sectors. Second, inability to rent out land will affect the efficiency of land allocation, because there would be some farmers who would not be able to get enough land, but there also would be some farmers that will use more land than they're supposed to, because they're not able to rent it to other people. And finally, inability to use land as collateral prevents households to get access to credit, and this effect particularly strong for the poorest one who do not have much of financials. Now let's look at like a little bit more formal, or how this would look in the calibrated model. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to show you a number of slides or graphs which are going to show you the differences between the household's decision made by those who live under communal land versus private land. And just to keep in mind, all the small plots that I'm showing, they're just slices of the entire distribution to make this kind of presentation more intuitive. And the first one, I'm going to focus on the land misallocation. So this particular plot shows you the ratio of the land usage by communal farmers relative to how much the same farmers would use if they had private land. And I'm starting with those who own large pieces of land. And here on this plot, you have financial wealth or level of assets on the x-axis and the level of agricultural productivity on the y-axis. So importantly from this graph, what you should see is that it's quite dark, meaning that this ratio is higher than 1, suggesting that communal landholders using more land conditional on becoming farmers than the private one. So why is it using more land? This comes from the fact that communal landholders are not able to rent out their land. So what's happening here, they have large piece of land, they're not able to rent it to anyone else, production function is increasing in land, so in optimum, they decide to use the entire land, while the private landholders, they rent out pieces of land. So this inability to rent out land basically results in overusage of land by communal landholders. Next, if we look at the medium-sized landholders, on contrary, part of the plot is very light, meaning that communal landholders actually using less land than the private one. So why this happening? This primarily comes from the inability to use land as collateral. So what happens here? So communal farmers, they look and decide how much land and capital they want to use in their production. And then, since they couldn't use land as collateral, they're only able to use their financial wealth. And those who highlighted in light, they're financially constrained. So they're not able to obtain enough capital. Given that they're not able to obtain enough capital, in the optimum, they're not using as much land. And as you can see, this kind of effect vanishes and become equal to 1 for those who are super rich. For those who are super rich, they don't care whether they can use land as collateral or not because they have enough financial wealth. And finally, when we look at the households who do not have any land, the entire plot would be equal to 1, meaning that there are no differences because they're not subject to any land market frictions because they don't have any land. Okay, and so this is a little bit bringing those pictures with the data, or like I call it sanity check. So what I'm doing, I'm simulating the data with my model and run pretty much the same regression as I described before. I'm regressing the amount of land used by each farmer, conditional being farmer, on his or her productivity, and pretty much I'm finding very similar, if not the same, point estimates. And then I also look whether there is heterogeneity between those who live under communal versus private land and compare to my outcome in the data. And it looks very similar. Now let me talk about labor allocation. So when households making their occupational choices, I'm going to start with households who are having very low entrepreneurial productivity, meaning that it's simply the households that do not have any business ideas, so their choice pretty much coming to become either farmers or become workers. And when we look at the private landholders, and again, this is a slice, those private landholders not subject to financial frictions, but what you see here, that their decision is based on their level of relative productivity. So those who are productive in agriculture are going to become farmers. Those who are not, they're going to become workers. However, if we look at the communal landholders, most of them are going to be farmers. So why are they becoming farmers? First is because of expropriation risk. So households knowing that if they become workers, their land might be taken away from them. Therefore, knowing those potential losses in the future, everything else equal, they prefer to stay in agriculture to prevent losing the land. Second, even if there were no expropriation risk, this threshold would be different. Because remember, they're not able to rent out their land, so their outside option is different. So becoming worker for them is less profitable than for those who are living under private land. And again, if I look at the data, I find that households with title land they're less likely to stay in agriculture, both in terms of the main employment of the head of the household and also in terms of the working hours of the household. Second, if we look again on the occupational choice of household, but now looking at those who have high entrepreneurial productivity or have some amazing business ideas. If we look at those private landholders who are not subject to any financial frictions, all of them decided to go and become entrepreneurs. On the contrary, similar to the previous picture, when we look at those who live under communal land, they're more likely to stay in agriculture. And again, where is this coming? The first one, similarly to the previous one, is because of expropriation risk. They're afraid to lose their land if they're moving outside of agriculture, and therefore they less likely to become entrepreneurs. And this effect is very pronounced or like very visibly seen if we compare the same type of households, but those who own medium land and those who own large plot of land, and we observe that the effect of staying in agriculture is way larger for the large landowners, because simply losing a larger piece of land in the future is more harmful or creates more loss. Do I observe this in the data? And the answer is yes. So when I look whether your occupational decision depends on the size of your land across both private and communal landholders, I find that it depends on the size of your land, but only for those who have untitled land. So size of the land doesn't determine your occupation for those with private land or those who have title, but it determines your occupational choice once your land is not titled, similar to what I find in the model. The second reason why we observe that more people stay in agriculture compared to become entrepreneurs in communal land property right regime, it's again collateral channel. So in the model, I assume that production function of entrepreneurs is way more capital intensive than the production function of agriculture, similarly to the data, and therefore there is in optimum more capital required to become entrepreneurs. So as you can see, this can perfectly be reflected for this kind of step function, because the probability of becoming an entrepreneur for the same characteristic is increasing with financial wealth. Because those with financial wealth are not constrained, so for them it doesn't matter whether they can use their land as collateral or not. Okay. And surprisingly, on time, probably because there were no questions. But now let me talk to you about the effect of land reform. And I hope after I describe the mechanism, it's going to be very intuitive, but it also could be that I'm delusional about this. Okay, so what I'm doing in my main exercise, I'm looking at the effect of two steady states. So I'm starting with a steady state calibrated to the current or situation in Tanzania in 2013, where 20% of land is being private land and 80% of land is being communal. And what I'm doing in my main exercise, I'm basically moving from this mixed economy to the economy where all the land is private land. So we privatize all the land. So what I find as a result of this reform, that it leads to quite substantial increase in agricultural output by 7.2%, or 7.6%. And this effect is driven by two things. First is by ability to rent out communal land. So as a result of this, land utilization or land supply increases, so land utilization goes to 100%, which of course drives up agricultural inputs and as a result agricultural output. However, the main driver of this increase is improvement in agricultural productivity, which comes from the fact that as a result of this reform, land is being reallocated from less productive farmers to more productive farmers. And this reallocation drives around 70-80% of this increase. Even more surprisingly for me was that this land reform also leads to increase in non-agricultural output by even higher magnitude, by 8.2%. And this increase is driven first by better allocation of households across different occupations. Now, with the removal of the frictions, households are able to move to sectors where they're actually more productive, increasing average productivity in non-agriculture as well. But also now they're able to use land as collateral, meaning that inputs in non-agriculture increasing because they have access to more capital, and as a result of ability to use more capital, they also increase demand for labor. Yes. Steady state to steady state. I'm going to talk about transition dynamics if I.
Given you're not fixing the financial constraints, so you're accumulating more assets.
So interestingly so financial constraint here is fixed. So in this exercise, and in Tanzania it's crazy financial constraint. So it's like collateral to loan value is 250%, which is even high by sub-Saharan Africa. So this I'm fixing, so this doesn't change. But then I'm looking at the effect of financial reform as well and compare with this. Okay, so now a little bit more about other things that coming from general equilibrium. So what's happened as a result of this reform in terms of occupations, we observed that households moving from being farmers to become entrepreneurs and workers. So why this is happening? First, removal of expropriation risk makes people not willing to stay in low productive agriculture anymore, simply for the fear of losing their land, so they're willing to move to other sectors. Secondly, more people can enter entrepreneurship because now they're less financially constrained, so they can start their business. And now when we look at the prices, more entrepreneurs exist now. And second, even existing entrepreneurs are less financially constrained. Therefore, the demand for capital increases, pushing the price of capital up. Since the demand and the amount of capital increases, it also increases the demand for labor, pushing wage up, and as you can see, the amount of workers increasing. Surprising result is that the price or rental rate of the land is declining. And there are two reasons. The first one is, again, ability to rent out land, which, as I mentioned, increased land utilization or land supply. So land supply increased, therefore this pushes the prices down. But second important result, or where this comes from, you see that many people want to move outside of agriculture. And again, this model is a closed economy, so all the markets have to clear. So to prevent all this huge outflow of people from agriculture, the input prices or profitability of agriculture has to increase. And since I'm not changing agricultural production function, the only way for this to happen is for a decline in the prices of inputs, which is including rental rate for the land. And you can see this even more clearly. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if we compare partial equilibrium, where all the prices are fixed, the outflow from agriculture way larger. So part of this decrease is to prevent people from going from the agriculture. Okay. And this is my last slide, and I believe I have 3 minutes. So I'm not sure, but let me just briefly summarize other things that I'm doing in the paper. So the model is very rich, so it allows me to do many things. And kind of this is where the main contribution to the literature comes from. And first, as you've seen, compared to other models on land market imperfections, it has 3 different land market frictions modeled separately compared to we have one land market wedge, which allows me not only to study land market reform as a whole, but also to decompose it to different channels. So I could separately look, what would be general equilibrium effect if we just allow land to be used as collateral, so on. And I think it's particularly important in low-income country setting where even if reform is being decided, implemented by the government, it might not go super well. So when I look at different channels, I find that really what drives the increase in agricultural output is this ability to rent out land, because it increases land utilization, but also this is what allows land reallocation across farmers. Increase in non-agricultural output is primarily driven by collateral channel and no expropriation risk, or kind of now we remove this expropriation risk. And here, just to give you a little bit magnitudes without going to the details, it's mostly coming from collateral channel, because I'm able to measure this expropriation risk in the data, and it's not super high in Tanzania, at least the current rate is around 9%. But both of those channels, they're really driving non-agricultural output. Coming back to Inger's point, in the mainland exercise, I'm keeping financial sector imperfect. But then having those 2 imperfections allows me to compare the effect of 2 different reforms. Again, when we think about low-income country setting, most of those countries, I mean, in case Tanzania, they're not even able to implement land reform, but generally most of those countries not able to implement first best and improve all the markets. So this model kind of allows you to compare the results of different reforms or how they would affect different sectors differently. So what I find as a result of financial reform, when I kind of relax financial constraints to the level of advanced economy, I find that its effect on different sectors is very actually similar to the collateral channel of land reform. So it's kind of depressing agriculture, really improving non-agriculture. But what is different is that financial reform has very different distributional consequences. So when we look who is affected by land reform and financial reform, we observe that land reform on every angle is great because it also decreases inequality measured by consumption. And why it decreases inequality? Because when we think about those who are the poorest and who benefit the most, is those households who do not have any financial wealth and not able even to accumulate it, but they have some land, and then when the land being privatized, their gains are tremendous. So the consumption inequality actually with the land reform is decreasing because the poorest benefit the most. And probably if I measure this in terms of the utility equivalence, it would be even more pronounced. On contrary, financial reform, it really benefits those who kind of already not doing that bad, is those who already have access to finance by simply expanding how much they could get from this finance. And therefore, and if we care both about inequality and the output, of course, land reform looks way more attractive. And finally, I'm computing post-reform transition dynamics just to see whether moving from one steady state to another one doesn't take 2,000 years, and it looks reasonable. It seems that the most changes happening within the first 7 years, but like fully like in the epsilon, we're moving in around 20 years. Yes, and I'm happy to finish here because this part is infinite amount of time can be talked through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go to questions. Okay, one question for me. Do you have a possibility to observe in your data whether you have this general equilibrium effect on the prices of land?
So prices of land is the trickiest part, very unfortunately. And this is partially, I didn't go into detail because of the sake of time, how I model land market precisely in my paper. But the problem, land transactions are very rare, still very rare, because like even now the percentage of private land is like 20% there. But beyond this, in the surveys that I have, the only questions I ask, what do you think the price of your land? So, of course, I looked whether it's differentiated by the title or not, and I find that perceived land price is higher. And here are my two explanations. One is like the one that I could justify completely by my model result is that like, oh, this is just a perception, it's not actual price. But I want to be honest, and there are some limitations of my model. And this is where I see where there is one effect of land price that I'm not capturing. Again, it is because I didn't talk too much about how I organize land markets, but basically once we move for land reform, because the way the land market organizes, households not internalize the fact that they could use land as collateral in the price of the land. So they internalize it from other perspective, but not in the price of the land. Therefore, I'm not capturing this increase. But in reality, they probably would. Unfortunately, I mean, you have to make some compromises in those models, and this was the one I made, but I recognize it.
So. Okay.
In your data, do you see some households owning both private land and?
Yes, again, it's like this is something that I assume here that households either private or not. But this is I'm not concerned based on the data, but I do observe that some households own both, because they might inherit some piece of land, and then they'll receive something from communal chief. So it doesn't bother me that much because the way I'm doing in the model. Yeah, so it's like when I do in the model, I'm matching. Yeah, so I'm matching exactly the distribution of land, of private and non-private across household. So what I'm doing, I'm actually, the way I'm calibrating model, when I say 80% of land communal, it doesn't mean that 80% of household own communal land. It means that I'm exactly matching this distribution. So it's 80% of land communal, but it's not necessarily reflects that it's owned by 80% of household. So this is why I don't see this as a problem for the model. For the empirical part, all the measures of security of land property rights, it's not dummy variable 1 or 0, it's exactly the share of private land owned by each household. So I'm taking this into account as well. But yes, I observe this in the data.
And does it change by level of financial assets in the household?
Whether the title and so what I financial, so I don't observe financial assets. What I know about them, I know the credit, so I know whether they took credit or not, and I observe that they're more likely to take credit once they own title land. And I observe in terms of the assets mostly capital for agriculture or some durables, and I observe that title landholders more likely to use capital in their production. Yes.
Okay, so
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.